Welcome to the voices of transparency and excellence. We're not pivoting, the world is spinning like a top. Let's stop, figure things out, get some answers. Come with us on this ride. Warm regards, Rick and Judy.
Welcome. I'm Judy Brown Clark, and welcome to the podcast series where we address crucial topics impacting our campus and community. Rick Gateau was on assignment this week, and so I will be by myself, and I have an incredible podcast today that we are talking about the state of communication in our society, and it's a huge topic, as you can imagine. And there's just a lot of critical things that we're hoping to get in this condensed amount of time, and I'm so excited to be here with Laura Lindenfeld, the Executive Director of the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science and the Dean of the School of Communication and Journalism, and Elizabeth Boscia at the Alan Alda Center also. She's a certified trainer and assistant professor of practice here at Stony Brook University. So let's get started. You both teach communication, and so I wonder if we could just, at the top of this, think about the top 3 things that you teach in communication that you think are just critical for ensuring that the sender-receiver model is in its truest form. So who would like to start? Should we start with Ebeth?
Sure. I'd be happy to start. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you both. I think for me, and I've primarily been teaching science communication the last several years. So with those students, I think it is really important to first and foremost teach them skills of empathy and connection. Audience-centered communication needs that. I think second to that, and maybe related, is to teach curiosity in communication. If we as communicators can stay curious about our audience's experience, if we think of questions to ask before we offer our own opinions, we can get closer together, and I think communication becomes more effective as a result. And finally, I'm going to say creativity is my number 3, because to be adaptable, to be able to create new ways of saying something, not fall into reciting a script, not do a lecture, I think we need to be playful in a way and be able to invent things that fit that moment. And it's an art. And I have an art background, so it goes very well for me in my classroom. So those are my 3. Are those similar to yours,
Laura?
Of course, they're similar, Ebeth. I'm going to maybe repeat a little bit, but also rephrase. The first one for me, I mean, look, 3 is a short list.
Yes.
First one is really listen. Really listen. Listen more than you talk, which invites curiosity. So, Ebeth, you and I are jamming on the same frequency here. The second one is to be fully present. Really be present with other people, who they are, what they're bringing, what they need. That's the piece around empathy that we care so much about at the School of Communication and Journalism and the Alda Center. And the third one is, I'm going to throw something totally different in there. Have you ever looked up the root of the word? I love etymology. I love words. The root of the word communication, it comes from the word community, not the other way around. We communicate because we're in community, and communication helps us form community.
So what I love about what you both said, and it's so interesting because if you kind of map what you said, it kind of falls into the being present, being empathetic, listening. As simplistic as you have both outlined that, why is it such a complex skill for most people to actually not only in the listening piece, because we think of communicating as always, kind of sending the message, but receiving the message is as important. But in today's society, we see incredible examples where communication is not let's just say it absolutely has areas to improve. So kind of give some insight around how do we take the things that you just outlined, and then how do we cultivate that within our society? And we'll just stay within nation, and then we'll start from more of a global perspective.
I just was chuckling as you asked this question about why it's so hard. And I'm looking at the two of you and thinking, are you married and do you have families? How does that work? I mean, it's hard because we're not in someone else's head. So the whole idea of why the Alda Center was founded by wonderful Alan Alda was to practice empathy so that you're doing your best as a human to imagine what it feels like to be someone else, what someone else might be thinking. I'm bringing in both an emotional and a cognitive function. What is that other person experiencing, and how are they perceiving that and conceptualizing it? So if you take that from a situation with someone you love who you might disagree with, happens all the time, right? And you amplify that to something like social media, it gets harder and harder and harder. Ebeth, you're shaking your head.
I agree. And I think I can jump in and talk a little bit about it getting harder and harder, and some of the things that we've learned from communication researchers about why those obstacles come up. I mean, first of all, we as human beings, part of our human condition is to not be present in the moment. My internal monologue has been going even as I'm here and I'm focused and I'm very goal-oriented right now. I'm excited to have that conversation. I thought about my dog. I thought about something else, right? We always fall out of the present moment. And so one of the things that my theater background and one of the training methods that we use at the Alda Center does is it trains you to recognize those moments when you fall out of it and jump right back in without judging yourself, without creating a whole other thing about it. It just, that's what happens, is that it's hard for us to stay present. We are humans. And I think another important thing that comes as a factor is context. So, Laura, we're both talking about being audience-centered. I think you also have to be aware of the context. Social media is so different than giving an in-person talk at a library, let's say, for example. You can't use the same strategies. But sometimes we get into habits as communicators. And so you get in front of that audience, or you try something that worked really well with human to human on social media, it doesn't go as well. So we have to think about what advantages and disadvantages these different forms of communication have, and think a little strategically about that. And think about what our audience might know or not know. Or I think we might get into this in a little bit. What kind of language might appeal to them in terms of opening up an entry point into what you want to talk to them about?
So one of the challenges, particularly when you talk about your audience and context, is there's a certain amount of due diligence that you need to do when you're talking to a broader audience. In particular, if you're talking to an audience that doesn't have the same core values that you have, the same experiences that you have. What are some of the things that our listeners can do when they're communicating with an audience that may not be aligned in their perspective, or could absolutely be opposite of their perspective? How do you communicate for actually having a productive conversation that isn't focused on agreement?
I'm going to come back. So it also depends on whether this conversation is person to person or mediated, just like Ebeth said. I'm thinking, and this would be another interesting episode for you, is to talk to one of our other faculty in the school, Professor Xia Zhang. He and I have recently been writing a chapter in a book looking at different affordances that different types of communication give you. So what does person to person afford you that's different from social media, that's different maybe from more traditional TV broadcast? But I'm going to come back to some of these same principles that we grounded ourselves in the beginning, and that is, the higher the challenge, the more you really have to listen. And I think you need to be really self-aware, present with yourself, managing your own affect. I love this idea, and we use this in our workshops with the Alda Center. Human beings are feeling beings who also think. We're not fundamentally thinking beings who also feel. So if you start with the premise that most of the time it's feeling driving behavior rather than the other way around, and you can slow your feeling down and be aware of it. By the way, meditation and exercise are great for this as a form of self-management. The more likely you are to be aware of how you are interacting in this situation. So I think that self-awareness is really key. And then really some discipline as to what the situation would require for you to serve the ethics and values that are really core to you.
So, Ebeth, let's drill down now. Science communication. We certainly know that a lot of science, a lot of research, and even within the healthcare frames, there's been miscommunication, there's been mistrust. Sometimes we speak within our scientific and our technical language that doesn't always translate to common understanding. So talk a little bit about some of your strategies to make sure that we're communicating our science in a way in which people are understanding and valuing it, and maybe talk about it from a health perspective and what does it mean for patient care.
That's a great question. Yeah, science communication, when you apply it to healthcare, there's really two streams that we can look at. One is that patient-provider and provider to maybe caregiver relationship. And that would be very similar to any expert talking to someone who is, having an exposure to maybe some new information for them. This doctor may have told 50 people in the course of their short career about diabetes, type 2 diabetes. It is that patient's first time being diagnosed with diabetes. So thinking about, I think for those conversations, recognizing in this audience-centered approach that it's also about, this is my 50th time, but this is this person. This is the first time I've told this person about diabetes. And so this person might need a less direct approach. Maybe they need to, as you were saying, feel something first, and then I can give them some more information. Or maybe this person's very detail-oriented, and they need me to get into this schedule right away and then zoom out about what this might mean for them. So there's no one size fits all. And it gets harder to do the more reps you have, right? I'm going over the same information again and again. Think about these actors that do long runs. How do they stay present to all of that? Night after night or matinee as it goes on and on and on. And this is this practice of being present, this mindfulness that you're talking about. I think there are some wonderful examples out there of really very patient-focused providers, I would say. Hawkeye Pierce, Ellen Alda's character on MASH, has actually inspired quite a few people, and I've been privileged to hear them talk to Ellen about how that character, who always had a healthy dose of sarcasm, could have an infallible moral compass and just cut through all the BS and get right to the patient and care about them, was really inspiring to them. To do that in that way. But there's other kinds of communication that is also really important to people in healthcare. And this is something that I've been exploring with an amazing team of researchers for the past couple of years through a grant that we got through HRSA. And that's that how they communicate as a team. If you're think of it, I love this analogy because it's theater oriented. If you think of patient provider as sort of the onstage, you know that you're going to have to talk to somebody about something. You might not be as aware of what you're doing backstage with your fellow team members, but that team communication between doctors and nurses, between anyone across the continuum of care, it turns out it makes a difference. It makes a difference to the resiliency of individuals, to the team resiliency. Team is kind of an in-between. It's not a institutional and it's not individual. It's the sweet spot in between. And so we've been working on focusing on that as a core training module for folks in healthcare. And we got a chance to do it with almost 500 people at Stony Brook Medicine recently. And it was I learned so much through it. I mean, we came in with a really good plan, but to see again and again how this can be applied and how this might make a difference, staying curious about people, even if you worked with them for a long time, right? Going off this idea that, you were saying, Laura, about we can have assumptions about our audience. We can think in an audience-centered way and say, oh, I know this person. I know what they're going to say next, right? And then we cut off possibilities of maybe having a different outcome. So this is something that we go over with team members. Don't write off, oh, I know what Judy's going to say. I know this. I know how Laura does. I'm just not even going to bring it up. I've already had the conversation in my head. I don't have to listen. But how can I ask a question that might unlock another way of being? And that works with patients too. It does. It works with people who are on the other end of that as well.
There's something here to be said about turning down arrogance and turning up humility. Just this idea that you really don't know what someone else is experiencing. You may have an experience with them that repeats itself, but that doesn't mean you're going to get exactly the same thing again, especially if you're willing to change how you open things. I think sometimes we don't even realize how much our body language, our nonverbals convey something, and then we get the same thing back and we're like, yep, there, she did it again.
So it kind of leads me to, it would be nice if it was binary, sender, receiver. One person's delivering the information, one person is consuming and processing the information. And now we have the third kind of concentric circle, which is social media. And so when you think about who has been informing the person that either you're giving the message to or who you're trying to influence, talk a little bit about really using discretion, and how do you use large amounts of information and decipher that into something that is actually useful?
First of all, I don't think in the United States right now, unless you live in some really remote area and don't have a television or a Wi-Fi connection, that there's any such thing as only direct interpersonal communication anymore. I think we're much more permeable. We text each other, we see stuff online, we react, so it's much more complex. I'm going to share 3 thoughts I think can be helpful here. And the first one is, when you experience something online, it's just first check your emotional reaction. I remember I used to teach film studies way back in another life, and the first thing I would ask the students to do, and they'd be surprised, is like, how'd that make you feel? What kind of feelings did you bring up? Because a lot of this media is designed to make you feel something and trigger a behavior. So if you can pull yourself away for a moment and say, how did that make me feel? Then see if you can paddle upstream. It's hard work. Why is this message coming? What is the source? Where is it from? Who might be sending it? And then third, what is the response they're hoping for from me? It helps you step back a little bit from yourself and assess how something is landing with you and imagining what its intentions are.
What I love about that is it does require the self-discipline of a pause.
Yes.
And that's a sophistication
Yes.
that I think is extremely difficult with these large language models that have kind of figured out how to interrupt your pause. If you start doing a search on something, you will find that that however deep you search, you start getting a lot of affirmation on that search in a particular way. So, Beth, let's go back to science and let's look at some of the noise around science and the support around even something around changing weather patterns, better known as climate science. Mm-hmm. it's so interesting that we have so many examples. I mean, real tangible examples of hurricanes and droughts and floods and tornadoes and yet there seems to be always a need to explain that this is not a phenomena. This is actually something that is happening. Talk a little bit about how our researchers are communicating in a way in which they're countering some of that, the noise.
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think one way, well, let me back up. I really think it comes down to trust. So what you're really asking is, how do I, as a researcher, establish trust with my audience and get them to want to hear what I have to say because they see me as a credible, reliable source. Because if they don't, then you're not going to get anywhere. Then it might turn into something that actually confirms their assumptions that they're bringing in about you. Right? Because it does. It goes both ways. When you're talking about communication model and sender and receiver, I always tell my students, communication is not something you do at someone, it's something you do with them. So even as you're working towards their goals, the other person or group of people also come in with something that they want to get out of that conversation and what they want to learn. And a lot of times it is to feel even more confident about the opinion that they came in with. And that feels really good when you're like, I knew it. I knew I was right. And we all feel that. Again, it's going by, we're human beings. But I think one of the challenges when you think about like healthcare communication and mass communication, I think about the example of vaccine communication. You talked about climate change. I think in healthcare, vaccines have been a huge problem because of the way that story functions with that. I was just reading a little bit up on this because I have a graduate student right now who's doing her capstone project in communicating science with us, and she's doing HPV vaccine outreach. So it's really interesting stuff to look at it. And it makes so much sense to me as someone who came to this work as a storyteller, as an artist, that if you have a negative effect of a vaccine, which is rare, it makes for a really compelling story. Something happens, there's conflict, there's adversity, there's all of this, right? What's the story when there is no side effect and the person doesn't get measles or whatever it is? Nothing. Right? It's so having to thinking about how you can tell a story that's really compelling, that also brings that up. I think I had an interesting personal experience about this, if I may, really quickly, and it's related to vaccines as well because my son became friends with somebody in his class, and it became like they were such good friends that the teacher was like, they need to hang out outside of school, right? So you have to meet the parents and this and that. And we were on a playground downtown Port Duff, just looking at the kids, not even facing each other, and he feels me out. He goes, so, and this is when everybody was getting COVID vaccines, right, or not, or deciding what they were going to do. He says, so did you vaccinate your kid, I'm like, yeah, I did. And then I took the bait. I was like, how about you? 'Cause I knew I had a choice at that moment. I could just be like, yes, I did. I'm going to go over here. So I engaged. I was like, let's do it. Let's talk to each other about this. We have an investment. We know that this relationship is important to the kids. So like, let's do it, And he told me that there had been that his father had a really serious complication from a vaccine. And so medically, he was exempt, and then his child then also, because there was a fear that this was going to happen. That's a really powerful story that's now lasted generations. And I thought, I had to think to myself, why am I so bought into this model? What is it? What's the story for me? And then I remembered, I said, well, in my family, the story was about my grandmother's brother who died really young because there wasn't a vaccine. And so the narrative in my family became, see, this is why we do this, because this poor kid that never got to grow up because he didn't have access to this vaccine. So two very different stories that come head to head. So thinking about, I think, that meaning making that we get from putting something in a narrative form is really important, and realizing that what you're coming up against is not, as you're saying, logic.
Right.
It's not logic. It's the feeling that we get from the meaning making of the stories that we carry with us. But stories are changeable.
Yep. So Laura, in just a couple minutes, can you talk a little bit about, and we've touched on the trust piece. And trust comes from credibility. And we've seen a lot of instances where people have communicated things and they've weaponized information in a way in which it fits a construct. So how do we tell our audience, and in just a couple minutes, how do we tell our audience how to be a real, thoughtful, present communicator and listener?
The first thing is, I always want to know who that audience is and what they care about, and start with that. Just to go back to the beginning of this conversation, being empathic doesn't mean you're always nice and soft. It means that you imagine how other people feel and how they might be thinking. You're never actually going to know that. I mean, you could have a million different feelings in the course of a day. But always trying to imagine what it feels like to be them is a really important step. And one of the things we do is we teach people to look at, like, look, there's a bunch of research out there on communication. I think this is the kind of thing where everybody thinks they do it well until it fails, and then it's somebody else's fault. I was at the National Academy of Engineering, and I said, we got something in common with you engineers. And they said, what? And I said, nobody notices engineering till it doesn't work. Communication's the same way. So I think we have to take seriously that there's research on this, and we need to go to that and look at it and inform ourselves and be strategic about how we communicate. That does not mean manipulative. Strategic means we ground ourselves in the audiences and what our goals are that we want to achieve, with the flexibility to be willing to change. Not that we give up facts, but that we shift how we might do things based on what we learn. Ebeth, your story was beautiful. It's a perfect complement to this piece.
That is really, and I think the willingness and the transparency, by sharing that, it absolutely talks and gave you that self-awareness, like, there are different perspectives than the perspective that I'm standing in. Well, I'd like to thank both Laura and Ebeth for your valuable contributions. Join us next time. We'll talk about veterans. And so for now, I'm Judy Brown Clark. Rick Cateau will be with me on our next podcast, and we welcome you and thank you for tuning in.